The Afghan sun, a brutal, white-hot orb, pressed down on the tarmac of Bagram airfield, leaching the color from the world and replacing it with a shimmering haze. 1,000 soldiers, a sea of perfectly aligned digital camouflage, stood at rigid attention. The air was thick, not just with heat, but with a formality that felt as solid as the mountains surrounding the base. For Captain Eva Rostova, the scene was both immense and infinitesimally small. The world had shrunk, compressed into the space between her and the man standing before her. General James Abrams was a figure carved from Army legend. His career spanned decades, from the cold shadows of the Cold War to the dusty counterinsurgencies of the modern era. His service ribbon was a mosaic of valor and endurance, a history lesson worn on his chest. He had just finished speaking. His voice, a low, gravelly tone amplified by the speakers, had echoed across the parade square. He had spoken of courage, of sacrifice, of an action that defied orders to uphold a higher law, the law of never leaving a fallen comrade. Eva stood frozen, her helmet tucked neatly under her left arm, the rough texture of its surface a familiar anchor, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. This was not how things were done. The script was simple. The general pins the medal, offers a handshake, a photograph is taken. But General Abrams had not reached for the blue-lined case holding the Distinguished Service Cross. Instead, he had taken a single, sharp, deliberate step backward. He straightened his spine to its full, imposing height, his eyes, sharp and discerning, locked on hers. Then, with a precision that spoke of a lifetime of discipline, he brought his right hand up, fingers snapped together in a crisp, formal, and profoundly resonant salute. The gasp from the audience was silent, a collective intake of held breath. A general saluting a captain was not part of the protocol. It was a reversal of the natural order, a gesture of respect so pure and unexpected it felt like a physical force. In that suspended moment, the present dissolved. The perfectly aligned formations blurred. The sound of the wind snapping the flags overhead faded into a different roar, the deafening thrum of Black Hawk helicopter rotors. The sterile, hot air of the parade ground was replaced by the memory of dust, thick and coppery, and the sharp metallic scent of blood. She was back there. The mission. Operation Hammerfall. The intelligence had been clear, the planning meticulous. But intelligence was just paper, and plans were fragile things built to shatter. They had moved through the village like ghosts, their footsteps silent on the packed earth. For 10 minutes they were invincible. Then came the sound. Not the rattling burst of an AK-47, but a single spiteful crack. A sniper. From a range they had been told was impossible. The shot had the finality of a judge's gavel. Private Miller, a kid from Ohio who talked endlessly about his mother's apple pie, had gone down as if hit by a sledgehammer, a cry torn from his throat that was more shock than pain. Eva hadn't thought. There was no room for thought. There was only the sight of Miller's leg, his uniform dark and wet, and the immediate, screaming need to get to him. She remembered the feel of the gravel biting into her knees as she slid to his side, the world narrowing to the tourniquet in her hands, the frantic yet steady rhythm of her own training taking over. "You're okay, Miller, look at me." "You're okay." Her voice had been calm, a lie she wielded like a weapon against his terror. Then, the order over the radio, cold and absolute. "Valkyrie 6, fall back immediately." And her own choice, the one that had led to this very moment, spoken into her comms with a certainty that still surprised her. "Cover me!" 2 words that defied a direct order. 2 words that had sent her sprinting back into the storm of fire, not toward safety, but toward the other trapped soldiers. The memory was a jagged shard in her mind, a whirlwind of noise and fear, and a determination so fierce it burned away everything else. And now, here, under the silent, watching eyes of the entire brigade, General Abrams held his salute. This man, a contemporary of her father, a man who embodied the very institution her father had revered, was looking at her not as a subordinate, but as an equal. He was acknowledging not just her action, but the reason behind it. The reason she had never spoken aloud, the reason that had lived in the quiet shadow of her father's legacy. She never asked for this. She never asked for any of it. But as she stood there, returning the general's salute, her own hand moving to her brow in a reflex of ingrained discipline, she felt something settle within her, the ghost of her father's silent judgment. A lifetime companion seemed to soften, to finally, quietly, nod in approval. The memory of the general's salute faded, replaced by the ghost of a different, colder presence. Her father, Colonel Mikhail Rostov. His world had been one of stark contrasts, of maps drawn in harsh pencil lines and ideologies that brooked no dissent. Her childhood was a slideshow of grim, gray military bases, a life measured in packed crates and temporary goodbyes. He was a man carved from the granite of the Cold War, his smile a rare and fleeting currency. His love, she had learned, was not expressed in words, but in a relentless, silent expectation. On her desk, next to her dog tags, sat a single, faded photograph. It was muted, almost sepia, as if color had been too frivolous for the moment it captured. Her father, young and severe in his Wabiyawu uniform, stared out from the frame, his eyes holding a distance that spanned continents and conflicts. He had never told her stories of heroism, only quiet parables about duty. "Duty, Ava," he would say, his voice a low rumble, "is its own reward. To seek applause is to misunderstand the purpose of the work." Praise in his eyes was a weakness, a crack in the armor. A nod of respect, a single word of quiet approval from him would have been a medal greater than any the Army could bestow. It was a prize she had spent a lifetime trying and failing to earn. She had joined the Army not for adventure, not for patriotism alone, but to step onto his battlefield. To learn the language he spoke so fluently, the language of orders, discipline, and sacrifice. She chose to become a medic, a healer. Where he had been trained to break, she would learn to mend. It was her own quiet rebellion, and yet it was the path she hoped would finally make him see her. She carried his ghost with her to basic training, through medical school, and onto the transport plane to Afghanistan. His unyielding standards became her own. Every bandage she applied, every IV she started, was done with the imagined weight of his watching eyes. Was it perfect? Was it enough? The desert was nothing like the cold, damp forests of his European stories. The dust here was fine and invasive, coating everything, finding its way into the seals of her gear and the crevices of her soul. The enemy was not a uniformed army lined up across a field, but an idea, a shadow that melted into villages and mountain passes. Yet, her father's lessons, forged in a different war, translated with a chilling clarity. "A Rostov is always prepared for the cost," he had said once, after a memorial service for a fallen comrade. She hadn't understood it then, not truly. But in the moments before a mission, as she checked and rechecked her medical kit, counting every roll of gauze, every vial of morphine, she understood. The cost was not an abstraction. It was the young private with the photo of his girlfriend. It was the sergeant who told bad jokes to keep the fear at bay. It was the weight of the helmet on her head, a weight that felt, at times, indistinguishable from the weight of her father's legacy. She wrote to him, dutifully, every week. Her letters were careful, clinical accounts of the landscape, the weather, the training. She never mentioned the fear, the close calls, the sound of incoming mortar fire. She described treating a simulated wound during an exercise, but never the visceral, hot spray of real blood on her hands. She was still writing for that nod, crafting a version of herself she hoped he would find worthy. He never wrote back. His silence was a constant, a void she filled with her own striving. In the stillness of the Afghan night, under a canopy of unfamiliar stars, she would look at that old photograph. The stern young man in the frame held all the answers, and she was still fighting halfway across the world to ask the right question. The briefing for Operation Hammerfall was held in a low, sandbagged building that smelled of dust and stale coffee. The air was thick with a focused tension. Captain Eva Rostova sat near the back, her posture straight, her father's invisible presence in the seat beside her. The mission commander, a major with a face etched by sun and stress, stood before a large digital map. A red icon pulsed over a cluster of buildings identified as the target village. The objective is a high-value target, a bomb maker known as the Engineer. The major's voice was clipped, efficient. "He's here in this compound. We have a narrow window." The plan was laid out with tactical precision. 2 teams would insert under cover of darkness. Valkyrie 6, her team, would secure the western approach. Raptor 2 would take the east. It was to be a swift, violent grab, in and out before the enemy could mobilize. Then the intelligence officer took the floor, a younger man with a nervous energy. He zoomed the map in on a rocky outcrop overlooking the village's main street. "This is the primary complication," he said, his laser pointer circling the ridge. "We have intermittent signals intelligence suggesting a sniper team here. The terrain makes it a perfect nest. It gives them a clear line of sight down the entire avenue of approach." He paused, letting the image sink in. The street below was a long, exposed corridor of packed earth, flanked by crumbling mud brick walls. "The range," the intel officer continued, "is extreme, pushing the very limits of the platform we believe they're using. Our assessment is that while it's a concern, the probability of a successful engagement from that position is low. Frankly, gentlemen, no one can reliably make that shot." A few of the soldiers shifted in their seats. The unspoken words hung heavier than the ones spoken. Low probability was not no probability. It was a calculated risk, a variable the machine of the mission had decided to accept. Eva's eyes remained fixed on the map, on that long, deadly street. She wasn't thinking about the HVT. She was already calculating triage sites, estimating the time it would take to cross that open ground under fire. Her medic's mind was running scenarios, each one ending with a soldier down, bleeding out in the dust. The major moved on, discussing extraction points and radio frequencies, but Eva was only half listening. The mission's clean, surgical objective had already been contaminated by the ghost of that sniper. Her father's voice, cold and clear, echoed in her memory. "Sentimentality has no place in a soldier's heart, Eva. The mission is the only morality." She could almost see him, sitting beside the major, nodding in agreement. The target was the priority. The potential cost was just that, a potential, an acceptable loss in the grand calculus of war. She looked around the room at the faces of her team. She saw the young ones like Private Miller trying to mask their fear with bravado. She saw the seasoned veterans, their faces neutral, already compartmentalizing the danger. These were not variables. They were men. As the briefing concluded and the soldiers filed out to prepare their gear, Eva felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The low probability felt like a lie. In her experience, the enemy often defied American probability. She found herself back at her cot, laying out her medical kit with a methodical, almost ritualistic care. She checked the tension on her tourniquets. She counted her chest seals and packets of hemostatic gauze. Each item was a tiny shield against the chaos she knew was coming. She was preparing for the cost her father had taught her to expect, even as every instinct screamed to reject it. The plan was set. The wheels were in motion. But as she zipped her aid bag shut, the sound was as final as a verdict. The night was absolute, a blanket of ink pierced only by the green glow of night vision goggles. The insertion was a masterpiece of silence. The Black Hawk helicopters, their engines a muffled thrum, dropped them off 2 clicks from the village. Valkyrie 6 moved like a single organism through the pre-dawn gloom, their footsteps whispers on the hard-packed earth. Eva stayed in the center of the formation, her medical pack a familiar, heavy weight on her back. The only sounds were the soft rustle of their gear and the occasional, static-laced whisper in her earpiece. For 10 minutes they were ghosts, shadows slipping through the sleeping landscape. The village walls loomed ahead, dark and silent. They were on schedule. The plan was working. Then, the world exploded. It wasn't the rattle of an AK-47. It was a single, sharp, spiteful crack that ripped the silence apart. The sound of the shot arrived a fraction of a second before its impact. It was the impossible shot, the one from the extreme range, the one nobody could make. Private Miller, who was walking point, was thrown forward as if hit by a truck. A choked cry, more of shock than pain, was torn from his throat. He crumpled to the ground, his leg a ruin of blood and fabric. The neat, orderly lines of the mission plan disintegrated in that instant. "Sniper! Sniper!" Voices yelled over the comms, sharp with adrenaline and disbelief. "Miller's hit!" Eva didn't hear the order to take cover. She didn't think. Her body was already moving, driven by a force deeper than training. She broke from the cover of the wall, her boots kicking up puffs of dust as she sprinted into the open kill zone. A second shot rang out, kicking up dirt a foot to her left. She didn't flinch. Her world had narrowed to the young soldier on the ground, to the dark, expanding stain on his trousers. She slid the last few feet on her knees, gravel biting through the fabric, her hands already tearing at the ripcord of her tourniquet. "Look at me, Miller! Look at me!" she commanded, her voice a strange oasis of calm in the storm of gunfire that was now erupting around them. The rest of the team had laid down, suppressing fire, the staccato bursts of their rifles deafening. Miller's eyes were wide with terror, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "My leg! I can't feel my leg!" "You're okay. You're with me," Eva said, her fingers working with a swift, practiced certainty. She positioned the tourniquet high on his thigh, cranking the windlass until the bleeding slowed to a trickle. She registered the sound of rounds snapping overhead, the zip of bullets impacting the mud brick wall behind them. It was all background noise. The only thing that mattered was the pulse she found in Miller's neck, thready but present. He was alive. She had reached him. Then the radio in her ear crackled to life. It was the voice of the mission commander, back at the Tuki, cold and disembodied. "Valkyrie 6, situation report. Acknowledge." Her team leader, Sergeant Evans, responded, his voice tight. "Tuck Valkyrie 6. We have one man down. Catastrophic leg wound. We are pinned by a sniper on the high ridge. Requesting immediate close air support and medevac." The response was immediate and brutal. "Negative, Valkyrie 6. The mission is compromised. Abort. I say again, abort. Fall back to the emergency extraction point at grid Lima 9er. "That is a direct order." Ava's head snapped up. She looked from Miller's pale face to the courtyard 30 yards away where Raptor 2 was trapped, their own firefight a desperate, contained chaos. She could see one of their men down, not moving. To fall back meant leaving them. It meant leaving that downed soldier. The order was logical. It was by the book. It was what her father would have called the hard necessity of command. But as she looked into the eyes of the young private whose life she held in her hands, the book seemed like a worthless thing, its pages blank. The order to fall back echoed in her ear, a cold, hard stone dropped into the churning chaos of the moment. Abort. I say again, abort. Eva's eyes met those of Sergeant Evans. His face was a mask of conflict, the soldier's duty to obey warring with the leader's duty to his men. He gave a sharp, frustrated shake of his head, his knuckles white on his rifle. They both knew what the order meant. It meant leaving Raptor 2 to their fate. Eva looked down at Miller, whose breathing was shallow, his eyes pleading. She looked across the deadly expanse of open ground to the courtyard where the trapped team was making their last stand. The sound of their fight was a desperate, dying thing. She saw one of their men, a corporal she knew only as Davis, slump against a wall, clutching his side. In that splinter of a second, the calculus of war became brutally simple. Obey the order, save herself and the wounded she had, and live with the ghost of abandoned men. Or defy it and gamble every life on the slim chance she could make a difference. There was no more time for thought. There was only the deep, resonant knowledge of what was right. "Cover me!" she yelled, her voice cutting through the din, not a request, but a statement of intent. She locked eyes with Evans. He gave a single grim nod. He understood. He would give her what he could. Eva was moving before the first covering round was fired. She pushed off from Miller's side and sprinted, a low, weaving dash toward the hell of the courtyard. A storm of lead erupted from her team's position, forcing the enemy to keep their heads down. The world became a tunnel of noise and dust. The snap of bullets passing close by was a constant, high-pitched whine. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not with fear, but with a fierce, burning purpose. She dove the last few feet, rolling behind the low wall of the courtyard, landing hard amidst the 3 remaining members of Raptor 2. Their faces were smeared with dirt and sweat, their eyes wide with the shock of seeing her. "Medic!" one of them gasped. She was already crawling toward Davis. His wound was bad, a gut shot, the kind that promised a slow, painful end. "Hang on, Corporal," she muttered, her hands already working, applying a pressure dressing, her mind blocking out the hopeless prognosis. She injected him with morphine, a small mercy against the inevitable. "The others?" She barked at the team leader, a staff sergeant whose name tag read Rivera. "Jenkins is gone," Rivera said, his voice hollow as he pointed to a still form in the corner. "Hendricks has a shrapnel wound in his arm. We're almost out of ammo." Eva moved to Hendricks, quickly tying another tourniquet on his upper arm. The courtyard wall next to her head suddenly exploded, chunks of mud bricks spraying her face. She didn't flinch. She just wiped the grit from her eyes and kept working. An RPG round hit the building behind them, the concussion wave slamming into them, raining debris down on their heads. For a moment, the world was nothing but deafening roar and choking dust. Eva used her own body to shield Hendricks from the falling rubble, feeling the impact of the stones on her back and helmet. Through the chaos, her radio crackled. It was Evans. "Rostova, we can't hold this position much longer. The QRF is 10 minutes out. 10 mics! You need to disengage now." 10 minutes was a lifetime. It was an eternity they did not have. Eva looked at the three faces around her. Davis, fading fast. Hendricks, pale but stable. And Rivera, his will the only thing holding them together. They were all looking at her. She had run into their trap, and now she was part of it. There was no disengaging. There was only holding on or dying. She keyed her mic, her voice remarkably steady. "Understood, Valkyrie 6. We are not leaving anyone. You fall back. Get Miller out. We'll hold here." She made the choice. She would share their fate. The 10 minutes Evans had promised stretched like hot tar, each second a lifetime measured in heartbeats and the sporadic crack of enemy fire. The dust from the RPG impact hung thick in the air, a gritty fog that burned their lungs and coated their tongues. Rivera and Hendricks returned fire in short, disciplined bursts, conserving their precious remaining ammunition. Every shot felt like a countdown to the end. Eva stayed low, pressed against the wall next to the fading Corporal Davis. She kept a hand on his shoulder, a human anchor in his drifting world. His breathing was shallow, his skin clammy. The morphine had pulled him from the pain, but it couldn't stop the internal bleeding. There was nothing more she could do for him but bear witness. "Medic, my kids," Davis whispered, his eyes glassy, fixed on a point somewhere beyond the crumbling wall. "You're going to see them," Eva said, the lie falling from her lips with a conviction she did not feel. It was a medic's duty, to offer hope even when there was none. "You just hang on. The cavalry is coming." She said it for the others as much as for him. Hendricks, clutching his wounded arm, glanced over, and she saw a flicker of resolve harden in his eyes. Her presence, her impossible, defiant presence, had become their talisman. Then, the enemy probed. A handful of insurgents, emboldened by the lull, tried to rush the courtyard's main entrance. Rivera dropped two with expert shots, the reports of his rifle shockingly loud. The others scrambled back. But the attempt signaled a shift. They were gathering for a final, overwhelming push. They knew the Americans were cornered, wounded, and low on ammo. "Last mag," Rivera called out, his voice tight. This was it. The perimeter was about to collapse. Eva's hand went to the pistol on her thigh. She was a medic, but she was a soldier first. She would not be taken alive. The thought was cold, simple, and absolute. Her father's face, stern and unyielding, flashed in her mind. He would have approved of this final calculus. It was then that the sound began. At first it was a low thrumming in the air, a vibration felt more than heard. Then it grew, swelling into a familiar, glorious roar. The distinct, heavy thump, thump, thump of Apache helicopter rotors. Two dark shapes crested the ridge, moving with predatory grace. The world erupted in a storm of vengeance. A Hellfire missile streaked down and obliterated the sniper's nest on the ridge in a fireball of orange and black. The 30-millimeter chain gun on the lead Apache opened up, its sound a terrifying mechanical ripping that tore into the enemy positions surrounding the village. Dirt, stone, and body parts were thrown into the air in a churning maelstrom. In the courtyard, the four of them huddled, stunned by the sudden, violent salvation. The enemy fire ceased as if a switch had been thrown, replaced by the screams of the wounded and the Apache's relentless cannon. The quick reaction force had arrived. Not in 10 minutes, but now. Minutes later, the thudding rotors of a Black Hawk medevac chopper descended into a cloud of its own making just outside the courtyard. A squad of fresh soldiers poured out, securing the area. Ava, moving on pure adrenaline, helped the new medics load Davis and Hendricks onto litters. She gave a quick professional handover to the flight medic, her voice steady as she listed their wounds, the treatments administered, the dosages of morphine. As they carried Davis away, his hand slipped from the litter and brushed against hers. It was cold. She never learned if he made it. She was the last one to board the Black Hawk. Her fatigues were stiff with dried blood, Miller's, Davis's, Hendricks's. It was not her own. As the helicopter lifted off, banking away from the shattered village, she looked down at the scene. The courtyard where they had almost died was now just another patch of dirt. There were no cheers, no feeling of victory. There was only a hollow, ringing silence in her ears and the profound, bone-deep knowledge of the cost. She had saved some. She had lost one. She had defied a direct order. As the helicopter gained altitude, she closed her eyes, not in prayer but in exhaustion. The battle was over, but the war for the meaning of her actions was just about to begin. The silence back at the forward operating base was louder than the battle had been. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a deep, resonant exhaustion that felt like a physical weight. A formal debriefing was held in the same sandbagged room where the mission had been planned. Ava sat straight-backed in a hard plastic chair, her hands folded on the table in front of her. The mission commander, the major, listened with a stony face as Sergeant Evans recounted the events. He described the sniper, Miller's wound, the order to fall back. Then he came to her. "Captain Rostova moved to stabilize Miller under direct fire," Evans stated, his voice flat and factual. After the abort order was given, she independently assessed the situation with Raptor 2 and determined their position was untenable without immediate medical support. She initiated a maneuver to reinforce their location, which allowed us to effectively cover their position until the QRF arrived. It was a masterpiece of military jargon, a version of the truth polished clean of disobedience and raw human impulse. He had painted her actions not as defiance, but as a tactical initiative. The major's eyes shifted to her. "Captain, your report." Eva looked at the worn surface of the table. She could still smell the dust and the blood. She could still see Davis's glassy eyes. She opened her mouth, ready to give the clinical, concise version she had rehearsed in her mind. She would mention treating the wounded. She would omit her sprint, her choice, the feeling of the rubble hitting her back as she shielded Hendricks. The words felt like ash in her mouth. "Sir," she began, her voice hoarse, "my primary focus was the preservation of life. I treated Private Miller's catastrophic injury under fire. I then observed that Raptor 2 had sustained multiple casualties and were unable to maneuver or effectively treat their wounded. I determined that my skills as a medic were required at their position to prevent further loss of life before the QRF's arrival." She kept her eyes forward, her tone neutral. It was the truth, just not all of it. It was the truth that wouldn't get her court-martialed. It was the truth her father would have given, spare, unemotional, and focused on the outcome. The major nodded slowly, making a note on his pad. The debriefing moved on to enemy strength and tactics. Ava sat through it, a ghost at the feast. She expected at any moment for the other shoe to drop, for the major to call her on her sanitized account, to demand why she had explicitly disobeyed a direct order. But the moment never came. The debriefing concluded with a terse, "Dismissed." In the days that followed, she returned to the rhythm of base life, treating sprains and fevers, the dramatic rescue of her team fading into routine. She heard the whispers, of course. Some called her a hero. Others, more cautious, said she was reckless, that she had gambled with the entire team's life. She avoided them all, spending her free time in the dusty gym or writing another unanswered letter to her father. She never mentioned the medal recommendation she heard was being processed. To her, it felt like a distant, abstract thing, unrelated to the gritty reality of what had happened. The real reward was seeing Miller learning to walk on a new prosthetic, and Hendricks, his arm in a sling, giving her a quiet, grateful nod across the mess hall. Their lives were her citation. She had no way of knowing that in a secure office half a world away, General James Abrams was reading a very different report. It wasn't just the sanitized after-action review. It was the sworn statements from Sergeant Evans, from the men of Raptor 2, from the pilots of the Apaches who had seen her lone figure in the courtyard through their targeting systems, still working on the wounded as the enemy closed in. It was a full, unvarnished picture of her valor. He read about the impossible shot, the refused order, the sprint into hell, the shared resolve in the courtyard. He read about the blood on her uniform that wasn't her own. He closed the file and looked out his window, a deep, quiet respect settling in his chest. The machine of the army had produced its official version, but the general, a warrior himself, knew how to read between the lines. He knew the difference between following orders and fulfilling a duty. He picked up a pen. The ceremony, he decided, would not be routine. The sun was a hammer on the Bagram tarmac, bleaching the color from the sky and baking the air into a shimmering haze. 1,000 soldiers stood in perfect, silent formation, a geometric pattern of discipline and dust. Captain Eva Rostova stood at attention with her company, her helmet tucked neatly under her arm, its rough texture the only familiar anchor in a sea of stifling formality. She believed it was just another ceremony, another speech from a visiting dignitary, another hour of standing perfectly still in the oppressive heat. Her mind was 1,000 miles away, in the cool, quiet shadow of her father's memory, still wrestling with the ghosts of the mission. Then her name was called, not as part of a list, but alone. Captain Eva Rostova, front and center. The command, amplified by the speakers, echoed across the parade ground. A ripple of confusion, then anticipation, moved through the ranks. Her heart stuttered, then began to hammer a frantic, wild rhythm against her ribs. Her legs felt numb as she broke from the formation, walking the long, exposed corridor between the lines of soldiers toward the raised dais. General James Abrams stood there, immaculate in his dress uniform, a chest full of ribbons telling a history of wars she had only read about. He did not smile. His face was grave, etched with the same seriousness she had seen in photographs of her father. He waited until she came to a halt before him, saluting sharply. He returned the salute, his eyes sharp and discerning, never leaving hers. He then turned to the microphone, his voice low and resonant, reaching every corner of the square. "Captain Rostova," he began, and the crowd was so silent his words seemed to hang in the hot, still air. "The army is a machine of orders and discipline, it must be. But there are moments when something more is required, something that cannot be dictated by a command." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "There is a higher law, the law that says we never leave a fallen comrade behind. It is a law written not in regulation, but in the heart of every soldier who understands the true meaning of the word duty." He began to narrate the story of Operation Hammerfall, but it was not the sanitized version from the after-action report. He spoke of the impossible shot from the ridge. He described her sprint into the kill zone to save Private Miller. And then he spoke the words she never thought she would hear from a man of his rank. When the order to fall back was given, Captain Rostova was faced with a choice. Follow a lawful command to safety or answer a higher one. She looked across a street swept with enemy fire and saw another team of American soldiers, wounded, trapped, and facing annihilation. And she chose. He detailed her second sprint, her treatment of the wounded under direct fire, her use of her own body as a shield from falling debris. He spoke of her radio transmission, her decision to stay with Raptor 2 and share their fate. He painted a picture not of a soldier who disobeyed, but of a leader who chose to save lives at any cost. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty, he concluded, his voice gaining a powerful emotional timbre. "I am honored to present you with the Distinguished Service Cross." He turned and took the medal from its blue velvet case. But he did not step forward to pin it on her chest. Instead, he did something that sent a silent electric shock through the entire assembly. He took a single sharp, deliberate step backward. He straightened his spine to its full, imposing height, and with a precision that spoke of a lifetime of service, he brought his hand to his brow in a crisp, formal, and profoundly resonant salute. The gasp from the audience was silent, a collective intake of held breath. A general saluting a captain was a reversal of the universe. It was a tribute from one warrior to another, an acknowledgement that some actions transcend rank. For Ava, frozen in time, the world dissolved. The heat, the formations, the watching eyes, all faded. In the general's salute, she saw it all. The dust of the village, the fear in Miller's eyes, the weight of Davis's hand. She saw her father's stern, unyielding face, and for the first time she saw not disapproval, but a reflection of the same unwavering code. He had been a man of duty, and she had finally understood its deepest meaning. It wasn't about blind obedience. It was about the courage to do what was right, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. Tears she had refused to shed in battle, tears she had held back through debriefings and nightmares, now welled in her eyes, tracing clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. She never asked for recognition. But in the general's salute, she found something far greater. She found absolution. She found understanding. And finally, she found the quiet, resounding echo of her father's pride. She returned the salute, her own hand moving to her brow, her posture as straight as his, and equal in the only moment that truly mattered.